Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Daniel Murphy and I am assistant editor of the journal. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article in the current issue of the journal. In 2016, the FHQ will continue publishing a series of 6 special issues in recognition of the quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513. Next year's special issues are dedicated to Florida history during the 19th century. The first, covering the years 1800 to 1870, will be guest edited by James Cusick, curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History at the University of Florida Library. The second, covering the years 1870 to 1920, will be guest edited by John David Smith, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Please look forward to publication of these issues in 2016. Today's podcast focuses on the life and career of Ray Mohl, a longtime professor and historian of 20th century Florida who passed away earlier this year. In today's interview, I will be speaking with Robert Cassanello, associate professor of history at the University of Central Florida, who studied under Ray as a graduate student at Florida Atlantic University. Robert and I will discuss Ray's contributions to Florida history scholarship, as well as his contributions to the history profession in general. Some of you may remember we interviewed Ray Mohl in 2011 and asked him to share his thoughts about the life and career of Stetson Kennedy upon his passing. We are saddened to have to bring this episode to you, but like Stetson Kennedy, Ray Mohl made a tremendous contribution to Florida history and letters. Robert, we wanted to do this special podcast to honor Ray Mohl. Can you tell me how you came to know him?
Yeah, I was a student at Florida Atlantic University in the early 1990s, and I was first an undergraduate there, and then I went through the MA program. And I met Ray Mohl. He was my professor throughout that time there. And so I got to know him in the classroom first. And when I decided to go to graduate school, I ended up going to Florida State University in the late 1990s, and he was instrumental in mentoring me through the graduate program at Florida State University, where I remained in contact with him. And eventually he moved to the University of Alabama at Birmingham in the late 1990s. And when I graduated from Florida State University, he had met someone from Miles College, which was a small, historically black liberal arts college in Birmingham, and they had asked him if he knew anybody that could teach history classes for them. And he said, I have a former student, I'll get him in touch with you, and told me about this opportunity. And that was my first job out of graduate school at Miles College. He happened to be in the right place, and he immediately thought of me, which was fortunate for me because my career started at Miles College back in 1999. And from Miles College on through to the University of Central Florida, where I am now, I've always stayed in contact with him, and he's always been a mentor and friend to me. And I recall seeing him at every conference, and this is a story we often, people who know Ray Mohl often say, is like, you cannot go to a conference without seeing Ray Mohl there. And I saw him at every conference I went to, and we always made time to spend together, either have lunch or have dinner, have coffee, and sort of catch up. So he's been sort of part of my life since around 1991, when I was an undergraduate student at Florida Atlantic University.
So you've known Ray a long time, and that was one of the reasons we approached you to write this obituary. I noticed when I was reading it that this is not the traditional obituary, but it's something a little different. Can you tell us what you did in this obituary and why you made that choice?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't write the obituary right away, and I know when Connie, the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly, approached me first, I told her that I wanted, at least a month to think about what I wanted to do. And so I took that time and really contemplated the type of obituary I wanted to write. And in that time, there had been a number of obituaries that came out that really kind of listed his books and articles, his awards, his achievements, and I felt all of that was out there. If anybody wanted to know who Ray Mohl was as a published scholar, those types of obituaries, were all over the internet. And so I wanted to do something different because I had a different perspective of Ray Mohl than I think, most people, in that I was in the classroom with him and he trained me, and so I understood, his thinking or his process of what history was and his philosophy to history. And so when I read something by Ray Mohl, whether it's a book chapter, an article, or a book, I oftentimes go back to the classroom and deconstruct what he taught me in the classroom and how he employed those very things in his own writing. And so for me, there was always the idea that was Ray Mohl, and I was concerned to some extent that would not be captured in obituaries. And so I wanted to write an obituary that really addressed who he was as a scholar. What are the ideas that Ray Mohl tells people who write history, or at least the approaches he takes to history? And that's sort of what I was trying to get at and why I made the choice I did. So, what makes my obituary different from other obituaries is that I sort of handle Ray Mohl in a way, the lesson of Ray Mohl or the idea of Ray Mohl, what's there at that kernel, and that's what I tried to kind of come away with. And one of the things I sort of learned where I started was I looked up the book reviews of his first book, Poverty in New York. And this one reviewer who was, at the time, this review was published in 1971, and this reviewer would have been someone who would have been a senior scholar to Ray Mohl at the time, who had just come out of graduate school, was in his first job, published his first book. And this person was named Gerald Grob, who at the time was at Rutgers University. And he criticized Mohl's book on Poverty in New York because he said it suffered from Mohl's, he used the term presentism. And that's what I really kind of came away with, because what he said Mohl was trying to do, and again, remember this is 1971, and he said that Mohl was trying to understand the past through a contemporary lens. And so to Grob, that amounted to to some extent like the practicing of historicism, or at least not a good practice of historicism, I should say. And what's interesting is now we're however many years out, 40 plus years out from this book review, and I think historians would be criticized if they weren't taking into account the present that they live, and putting that as a lens into the history that they research. And so, it clearly shows that Ray Mohl was ahead of the curve and sort of, he sort of bucked, the traditional system of the history profession he was coming into. And that's, something I distinctly remember in classes Ray Mohl talking about these types of things, that you can't expect pure objectivity from your work because you live and you're situated in a present that is just part of you. But it's your job to understand the ways in which you're not objective and that present comes to you. And so that's what he taught us in the classroom. And this, not only did he teach us this, but I think his work really exemplified this type of philosophy. So my obituary just sort of was a collection of these things, these ideas and these approaches to history that Ray Mohl taught me over the years, as a way to kind of preserve them and give him credit for these things. And maybe people later on who might not have had the pleasure to have met Ray Mohl will read his work and find these things in there.
So when we approached you for this idea of a special episode featuring the work of Ray Mohl, you mentioned to me that you had a 15-minute interview of him recorded in the fall of 2011. Can you tell me a little bit about this and how you acquired it?
Sure. In the fall of 2011, I taught for the first time a podcasting class, and it was a class where students would create local audio-based historical documentaries on aspects of Central Florida history. And there was a student there named Derek Hermsdorfer who wanted to do a podcast on I-4 as the impact of the interstate through Orlando. And so I don't know if I mentioned to him or he came to me and said, I'd like to interview this person named Ray Mohl. And I said, oh, well, I know him. Just tell him you're a student of mine, and I'm sure he'll give you an interview. And of course, Derek came back later in the class and told me how gracious Ray Mohl was with his time, and he was able to get this telephone interview. And so it altogether was a 15-minute interview, but what I had done in the class is I had the students only really take out maybe the best 2 or 4 minutes of each interview to include into their documentaries. So there was a great deal of that interview that's never been heard, and so I went back to that interview, and Derek had done such a great job of capturing the sound that the audio quality was really good. And so when I listened to it, I thought it'd be really good to sort of take out more clips from this interview that haven't been heard and use them in this podcast to sort of remember Ray Mohl.
Can you tell us what we're going to hear in this first clip?
Sure. So you understand that this interview was recorded for a specific purpose, that in putting together a documentary on the Interstate I-4 that passes through Central Florida. And so the thing that Derek was trying to get at with his documentary was the conflict that existed, because of course, conflict makes great story, makes great radio, and so Derek really wanted to kind of mine the conflicts that were inherent between policymakers and experts in the interstate highway system. So in this clip, Ray tells us about the conflict between city planners and engineers and how they fought over the planning and the ways in which the interstate system would be plotted around cities. And so let's hear this first clip.
But they already had these corridors showing where the interstates would go. The idea was to not just connect up the cities, but to penetrate them with urban expressways. And even the idea of beltways was part of this process for most of the larger cities. So it was a pretty complex process because there was a lot of controversy over where those routes were located, the kind of massive destruction that would be required in the central cities as they penetrated through neighborhoods and historic districts or parks, or sometimes even higher end properties. But mostly it was lower class, working class, white, ethnic, and black neighborhoods that were on the block here. So already by 1960, not much had been built yet, but there was an emerging dispute between the highway engineers and the city and regional planners. The planners were saying, hey, these interstates are great, but we need to have real planning. And the highway engineers said, we build highways, we know what we're doing. Now, the controversy was over the fact that the highway engineers were concerned. Yes, they knew how to build highways, and usually they were trying to build them in the most efficient ways to move traffic between point A and point B, usually in a straight line, and whatever was in the way, that was too bad. It was someone else's problem. The city and regional planners say, yes, we need these highways, but we need to consider the planning of them in a much larger context, not just an engineering concept, not just a traffic or transportation or automobile movement kind of a way, but to consider the larger pattern of land usage, of potential urbanization, consider the housing problem that was being created by penetrating the central cities and destroying neighborhoods. So there was a big controversy going on between the city planners, who had a larger conception in mind, and the highway engineers, who had a single-minded objective to build highways between point A and point B, and to move traffic more efficiently.
That was great. What do you have for us in this next clip?
This next clip, what I think Derek was trying to get at in this question was there's a lot of myths that go on about the policymakers in interstates, what were their motivations and things like this. And so what Ray does for Derek here is just sort of introduces all of the primary players on the national level that were involved in the interstate system and what motivated them and what policies they wanted to make sure were instituted in the interstate system. And like the earlier question that Derek asked Ray, there's a great deal of conflict here because these policymakers don't agree about what concerns should be addressed with the interstate system. And so I think Ray answers this question quite effectively, as we'll hear.
The highway engineers, traditionally, they were from state highway departments. They had never, for the most part, they were building rural highways. Going back to the very beginning, the idea of the Bureau of Public Roads was to connect up the farmer with the urban markets, get the farmer out of the mud, as they were saying at the time. So they were building rural highways, pretty much. And even a lot of the interstates connect up through rural areas. So it's not that big a deal when you're building a straight highway through unoccupied territory and through. It's much easier to acquire the land. It's not that expensive, and there are no real community objections and citizens groups fighting against them. But many of the people involved in urban policy who are not highway engineers, people like Robert Moses, who was a well-known urban power broker in New York City and around the country. He was a big promoter of regional parks and beaches. He was a big public housing builder in New York City, and also promoted highways. But he recognized the importance of relocating people whose homes were destroyed, in the same way that urban renewal legislation, which was passed in the same era as the interstate highways, had done. The urban renewal legislation required relocation of people whose homes were destroyed before you could take them. And that was established. So many cities, which did a lot of urban renewal, they also had a housing relocation agency that found new homes for people who were pushed out. And even Thomas McDonald, the head of the BPR, also favored this kind of approach. He was a much more of a political realist. He recognized that one way to get these highways done was to minimize the opposition, and never mind the humanitarian aspects of finding new homes for people whose places of residence were being destroyed. And he pushed for that in the late 40s, but the Truman administration rejected the connection between highways, urban highways and expressways, and housing relocation. They just didn't consider it because of Truman said it was too expensive and we couldn't get it through Congress. That issue surfaces much more prominently once they start building the interstates in the Eisenhower administration. And there you have the mindset of the decision makers. Eisenhower was interested in the interstates not so much as a major project that would speed up traffic and link up cities and so on, and even the potential economic development that eventually ensued. I don't think Eisenhower had any idea of the enormous impact that the interstates had on the eventual economic growth of urban America. Eisenhower was interested in the interstates for a much narrower reason, and that was to maintain an even keel in the American economy. During the post-war era, in the late 40s and into the 50s, there were a series of minor recessions. There were peaks and valleys in the American economy. People were thrown out of work periodically. That was a political issue. So Eisenhower was interested in a kind of a big public works project that would employ lots of people when the country was going into one of these minor recessions. So for him, building the interstates was a way of keeping the economy on an even keel by using public works and public employment to keep people in their jobs and keep the economy moving. That was his main concern. The issue about housing relocation also came up, but it was rejected by Arthur F. Burns, who was the chief economic advisor for Eisenhower. He later became the head of the Federal Reserve Board. Arthur Burns was a well-known economist at Columbia University. And there's a letter I found in the Eisenhower archives in Abilene, Kansas, from Burns, saying that people were arguing for the comparability of housing relocation policies between urban renewal and highway building. And Burns says, we can't afford that. It's too expensive. We're not going to do it. So there was a decision made in the Eisenhower administration in the mid-50s not to deal with housing relocation. And that issue then continued to bug politicians and the BPR, later the Department of Transportation when it was founded in 1966, until they had resolved that issue in the late 60s with the Highway Act of 1968, which required housing relocation before you displace people from their homes, and thus making it eventually, finally, comparable with the urban renewal policy.
So you have one last clip for us to listen to. I want to thank you for joining us today, and please tell us what we'll be listening to as we go out.
Well, thank you for having me, and I really enjoyed talking about Ray. In this last clip, Derek asks Ray about his work on Miami, because unfortunately Ray never researched Orlando or I-4, but he did a great deal of work, published numerous articles and book chapters on the interstate in Miami. And so Derek wanted to get a sense of how the interstate system in Orlando compared to the interstate system in Miami. So he asked Ray about what were the conclusions he came to. And so this last clip is really important, because in this 3-minute clip, Ray Mohl is able to address exactly what his contributions were to that decades-long study of I-95 and the impact of I-95 on the African-American community in Miami. So let's hear it.
Interstate 95 had a devastating effect when it was built. The urban expressway part of Interstate 95 was built into downtown Miami in the mid-60s. And they followed a route, essentially, that was laid out by the State Highway Department with the input of local civic leaders, political and business leaders. Interstate 95 came north-south into downtown Miami, and it traversed the major black community called Overtown, a large community of between 30 and 40,000 people at that time. And it went right through the main black business district. And there was a huge downtown interchange that connected I-95 with what later became known as I-395, an east-west expressway that connected Miami Beach with western Dade County. That big interchange alone destroyed the housing of about maybe 10,000 people, and there was lots more other destruction as well, and some urban renewal taking place in that area. Taken together, those two programs wiped out much of Overtown and destroyed its centrality as a black community and all of the businesses, the professionals, the cultural things going on there, and forced a relocation of people into other parts of Dade County. Now, all of this happened before that 1968 law that required housing relocation, prior to housing destruction. So what happened was most of the local agencies delayed, did nothing to deal with this issue, and basically forced the private housing market as a solution. And we have a lot of racial transitions that are going on as a result of tens of thousands of black families being pushed out of Overtown, and they move primarily into northwest Dade County, around an already established black community that was growing around a big public housing project that had been built in the late 30s, a black housing project called Liberty Square. And blacks moved into the area around that project, and eventually pushing out white communities and white neighborhoods as well in the process. And a huge area eventually grew called Liberty City, a 15 square mile area of northwest Dade County. And a lot of these racial transitions were facilitated by blockbusters and land speculators who were profiting from the transition, recognizing that the highway and the interchange in Overtown made for good profits elsewhere in the county. So as a result, you have a real racial divide, a geographical racial divide. If you look at a map of where blacks live today, it'll be heavily concentrated in northwest Dade County. And that was sort of predictable, given what was going on back in the 50s and in the 60s.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. In recognition of the quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513, the FHQ is publishing a series of 6 special issues, each devoted to examining Florida over the previous 5 centuries. We look forward to receiving your feedback on these special issues and other future volumes as well. We also invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. If you enjoy listening to this interview and know of others who enjoy history, please tell them about the podcast and have them find us on Facebook.